I'm Old Doc Mulder here to give you a taste of critical thinking. Episode 5, I think we're on. We're going to talk about the notion of supporting a belief. This is another central critical thinking concern. We need to first clear up some potential ambiguity here, some confusion. If somebody states their belief and I ask them, how do you support that belief? They might take a defensive stance and start talking about their right to hold that belief. And this has multiple possible interpretations. First of all, their legal right. Well, in free countries, that's a given. Freedom of thought, freedom of expression. So you have the legal right to believe the moon is made of green cheese. Fine. But then we can talk about other rights and obligations, the moral right to embrace a certain belief. Beliefs can be judged morally. For example, if you believe without any supporting evidence that your partner, best friend, a romantic partner, or somebody is cheating on you or talking smack behind your back without any evidence, that's immoral of you. You're doing your friend or partner an injustice to believe that about them without satisfying an obligation of evidence. There are other ways holding a belief could be justified. We could talk about pragmatic justification, maybe for psychological needs. Someone who's just witnessed some horrific events might have a compelling psychological need to go into a state of denial or to dissociate in order to try to preserve their sanity. But of course, that really works only in relatively short term. Somebody stuck in long-term denial, that's a psychological problem in itself, as well as a critical thinking problem. It gets more controversial to talk about maybe there's some social justification for embracing a belief system that is dominant in your society. It can contribute to social cohesion and understanding, and it can be a vehicle for communicating standards of behavior in that society. But then it's quite controversial how that justification of social cohesion really weighs up against certain belief systems obviously being fiction or superstition. However, in politics, you can see still that embracing a belief system merely for the sake of tribal cohesion, but it's generally not acceptable in enlightened societies. And then there's a more complex philosophical debate about whether there might be some, I'll call it existential justification for one to embrace specifically a religious belief. Famously, William James, in The Will to Believe, argued that it's an aspect of human existence, human nature, that we must confront religious questions. We cannot just remain non-committal. We have to commit ourselves one way or the other. And he recommended reasons for embracing religious belief that are not purely evidential reasons, but more reasons following from our nature, our existence. That can be sort of controversial. However, in critical thinking, the focus is entirely on evidential justification for a belief. That is, citing relevant reasons that logically lead to support the truthfulness of a claim you're making. To avoid the ambiguity of defending your right to hold a belief, I prefer to call this supporting a claim with relevant evidence. But then there's a lot involved there, which we're going to be talking about for weeks. First thing I want to make a point is demonstrating the mere possibility that your claim is true is not enough for support. However, you often see that from people if you challenge people who accept conspiracy theories. I've experienced this myself. You frequently get elaborate tales of how the first moon landing could conceivably have been faked. And the proper response is, sure, I guess it's conceivable, but so what? That doesn't give me reason to accept the belief. We need to establish probability, not the mere possibility. But a lot of extraordinary beliefs, you'll see people claim to support them, defend them, with articulating the mere possibility that is true. That's no good. Now, we need to address the social aspect of this. In a social situation, social intelligence should tell us that in certain situations, certain sorts of claims can be offered and there's not an expectation to provide support or evidence. You could just give a first-hand eyewitness report. You saw an accident on the highway and you expect people to take your word for it. But then other things are clearly controversial in our current society and need support, claiming we should use the death penalty or we should not use the death penalty. You make a claim there, you take on a responsibility to give some support, to be intellectually responsible, another critical thinking virtue. You have an obligation in the social situation to offer something. And this can change from one culture to another, from one time period to another. For example, when Copernicus and Galileo claimed the Earth was not the center of the universe, they had this obligation to provide supporting arguments and evidence because the prevailing view was Earth is the center of the universe. Today, we can claim the Earth is not the center of the universe, and people say, yeah, no, Sherlock. So that's an aspect of social intelligence that's important, critical thinking, to understand in any given social context what sorts of claims put a burden on your shoulders to provide some support. Now, a traditional fallacy that's been identified for centuries, historically called the appeal to ignorance, is really plays with this so-called burden of proof. It's a misplaced burden of proof. Somebody who believes in ghosts might say, well, you can't prove they don't exist, when the burden of proof is properly on the positive claim that there is such and such a thing. So this has to do with correctly identifying in a social context your intellectual responsibilities, your obligations. Certain terminology, we typically would use the word report for somebody making a claim that we'd accept without demanding supporting evidence. I report to you I saw an accident on the highway this morning. And you're expected to just take my word for it, legitimately so. On the other hand, if somebody is just spouting off, we should abolish the death penalty and there is an obligation to give some reasoning to support it, but you give nothing, it's left hanging unsupported. We could call that a merely unsupported assertion. You're just spouting off, here's what I think. Now, this phrase burden of proof, I don't especially love that. It's important to identify the burden of proof. That's a common phrase, but it's not, I wouldn't like to call it a burden. It's more like a responsibility or maybe even opportunity in a given social situation to back up something you're saying with relevant evidence. And then there's also the term proof that is problematic. Sometimes the word proof brings up in our minds absolute airtight proof, like a mathematical proof, 100%. And sometimes it's just proof beyond any reasonable doubt. The absolute sort of proof beyond any conceivable doubt, is limited in important ways. Most real-life beliefs, we look for belief beyond a reasonable doubt. That's a pretty high standard. That's what we use in criminal courts. The prosecution has to prove guilt beyond any reasonable doubt. In ordinary situations, if there's a lot at stake, we might demand that high standard. Or in ordinary life, more common sorts of just figuring out what's going on, we might just look for the overall balance of the evidence. Which way does it point us? The preponderance of the evidence, that's a standard used in civil cases, civil lawsuits. And then one more point of terminology you often hear in this context is people will say, is that a fact or just opinion? Claiming the idea is facts. You don't need to give an argument to prove it. We know that's a fact. Opinions, you have to give support to your opinions. Well, that's really shorthand for, on the one hand, clearly established facts. We take it as clearly established the Earth is not the center of the universe. It's clearly established the sun is much larger than the Earth. So we take that as a fact, meaning an established fact to a broad consensus in society. But keep in mind, there are some factual questions that we haven't figured out yet. Is there any intelligent life out there in the universe beyond our solar system? Or even life? We're still working on that one. Any form of organic life. So that's a factual question, but taking a stand on that does require you to give some supporting reasoning to back it up. And then on the other hand, opinion is usually shorthand for controversial, debatable opinion that calls for support. Like, it's my opinion we should have the death penalty. But some opinions are rock solid. Like, it's my opinion that 1 p.m. comes an hour after noon. That's an opinion, but it's not really, I don't have an obligation to give supporting reasons for that. So some opinions, the word opinion, technically it covers anything we believe, any belief, but in ordinary usage, it's often just restricted to the more controversial, debatable stuff that needs something to back it up in a typical social situation. So that's some of the complexity of just in this introductory idea of supporting a belief. Ambiguous, what people might be asking for, different approaches to that. But we're going to be focusing, starting in the next episode, on critical thinking, focuses on evidence in support of a belief, the kind of evidence that is indicative of truth to some extent. So, I hope you enjoyed that little discussion. Be well, think well, enjoy this little respite from the craziness of our lives, and I'll see you next time.